Welcome everyone to another episode of the Jewish Physicians Network podcast. Today we're bringing you something a little bit different. We have a recording from our yearly conference, a collaboration between JPN and Chemed Health. A heartfelt thank you to Dr. David Friedman, CEO of Chemed Health, and Chani Pillar, Special Project Manager for Chemed Health, for making this event possible. In today's episode, we delve into a critical yet often overlooked area for up-and-coming clinicians, the legal and ethical considerations that physicians and other clinicians should keep in mind before negotiating contracts for the first or subsequent employment opportunities. Our presenter, Jeffrey Adest ESQ, shared some legal pearls from his decades representing FQHCs, health systems, hospitals, individual physicians, and other clinicians. His insights were really invaluable and I think an important lesson for anyone in the healthcare field. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Okay. Good afternoon. So I'm here today to talk to you about a couple of topics. Principal one is about employment agreements, and I'll talk about some moonlighting type activities during residency. I will say this at the beginning, and then I'll repeat it at the end because I think it's very critical. We're going to talk about entering into an employment agreement when you are getting, I want to say a real job, but I don't know another way to say it, when you finish through all your residency and fellowship and everything like that and getting a job. The most important thing I'm going to tell you today is when you go out and do that, find a lawyer who is a healthcare lawyer to represent you in that contract. I want to say that I think that upwards of 90% of people go to the person on the corner who does real estate or wills or trust and estates and have them review the contract. And I guess trying to put it into your terms, if your knee hurts, you don't go to a neurologist, right? Make sure you go to someone who understands healthcare, because all the time I get people coming to me after the fact and saying, okay, I don't like this practice. I want to leave. I want to go someplace else. I want to be able to do things, be able to compete. And by that time you sign the contract that is very restrictive. Contracts tend to be very one-sided towards the employer when they're given to you. And like I say, most of the time we see the contract on the other side. We prepare those contracts and I see comments coming back, which it's clear that the person making those comments, it's like the third time in their life ever reading a contract and definitely don't know anything about healthcare. So make sure you go to a healthcare attorney. I have nothing personal in it because don't come to me. If you need names, I'll give you names of people. I don't do this really on behalf of employees. So I'm not doing this to try to get any business in any way, but I really would stress to you, make sure you do that. Okay. So now you've gone through residency, fellowship, whatever it is, and now you're going out and you're going to get a job. Right, so there are a variety of possibilities for jobs, obviously depending on your specialty.
Next one.
Down like two.
Next one.
Okay, so there's different types of employers, right? Certain specialties you don't have a choice but to work for a hospital. I'll tell you a little secret that most of the time when you think you're working for the hospital, you're actually not working for a hospital. You're working for a hospital physician practice, which is owned by someone on behalf of the hospital. I won't go through all the details of how that works, but if you're certain specialties, you don't have a choice but to do that. Other specialties, you have a choice and you can go out, right, and find any theoretical employer. We have seen, someone asked me before, what's the difference between now and 20 years ago? 20 years ago, I want to say that 90% of physicians practiced in small practices. And today it's probably 80% of physicians practice in large multi-specialty groups, either hospital-based or otherwise very large groups. The small 1 and 2, physician offices are pretty much going away. I'm not saying they're completely going away. There still is a need for them, pediatrics, something like that usually, but most physicians now work in larger groups, which gives you less bargaining power and gives you less opportunity potentially for the future, depending on what specialty you're in. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm just telling you to you practically the way it is. So some of the things you want to think about is, okay, I'll say that one of the things I've learned, right, is when I first started out, I never understood, right? I would say things to people and I would give an answer to someone and they wouldn't listen to me. And then someone else who had more gray hair than I did literally said exactly the same thing. And all of a sudden they said it and it was brilliant. One of the things that I've learned is having the gray hair, and I really don't mean to sound that old, but having the gray hair is you have to start thinking about the future, right? So when you're first coming out of school, you finally finished, you have, $300,000, $500,000 in loans. You're desperate to take any job, whatever I can get that can actually make some money now, be able to support my family. You got to think about what's the opportunity here for long term, right? Where does this job lead me to in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now? What is my career going to be? Is this job going to advance myself towards my career? Now, obviously, if you don't have a choice, you'll take whatever job you can get. But if you do have a choice, you got to be thinking about long-term, where does this take you? So I'm just going to pick an example. Someone was talking to me about this earlier today. In the short term, I'm just going to throw this out. I'll say this is personal to me. I represent what's called federally qualified health centers. Okay, these are health centers in what's considered to be medically underserved areas. If you go work for an FQHC, right, this is something you probably know this better than I do, National Health Services Corps loans, right, loan forgiveness. Every FQHC qualifies for that. So if you go work for an FQHC for 2 years, you will get a significant piece of your loans forgiven. FQHCs are also not-for-profit. So apparently if you work for 10 years in not-for-profit, you get all your loans forgiven. It's something to think about going someplace like that. Definitely if you have a lot of loans at the beginning. I think it's a good place to work long-term as well. If you're not going to be someone, right? Some people want to own their own practice. You're not going to ever own your own practice. You go to work for an FQHC, but I'm just throwing that out as an example of something to think about, which I think people don't think about enough as an opportunity. They are much better to work at than working in hospitals. Again, depending on your specialty, obviously, but hospitals, you're just a number. In an FQHC, you're a person. You also, I'll throw out, one of the things that people are always worried about is malpractice risk. In an FQHC, you cannot be subject to malpractice, right? You are deemed to be an employee of the federal government for malpractice purposes, meaning someone cannot, no matter how bad you screw up, no one can sue you for malpractice when you work in an FQHC. So I'm just throwing that out as a commercial. Okay, some other things. Okay, so there are, I want to say, within physician practices, you have 3 opportunities, generally within a hospital or within a other non-FQHCs, things like that. You only have 2 options, right? The terms we use here are dating contract, engagement contract, and marriage contract. Okay, so are you going someplace where it's just a 2 to 3 year commitment, and that's all you're getting out of it, which again could be fine depending on what you want to do. But if you're going to go into the private practice mode, you want to potentially have the opportunity for one of the second or the third option. So I'm going to say that, I don't know if anyone's going for anesthesia here. If you go for anesthesia, generally you're jumping into the third bucket, which is you are literally becoming either a partner on day 1 or the opportunity to become a partner a year after day 1. Because anesthesia right now is a tremendous shortage, and it's a, I'm not saying it's a good field to be in, but it's a good field to be in terms of getting a job and getting a road to partnership, where you can make a very nice living. Again, I'm not encouraging anybody for anything. Engagement contract means that you're going into something where there is a potential to have the ability to become a partner down the road. And usually there's some soft language built into that contract about, after 2 or 3 years, we'll notify you if you're going to become partner or not. This is an example of where having a healthcare lawyer is very important, because that language you could think that this language says that in 2 years from now, they're going to make me a partner. And most of the time it doesn't say anything close to that. It just says we might notify you if we decide and we're in a good mood that day, we might tell you something, which means it gets you nothing practically. So it's important to be able to negotiate some of these things to know what the potential future is. Okay, next. So now I'm going to talk about, now that you've found who the employer is, things to look for in the contract. Again, you should have a lawyer look at this, but when you start reading it yourself, these are things you should be paying attention to, because, right, I sometimes get calls from people and tell me they have, 6 offers and don't know what to look for. And I'm like, why don't you look for yourself before you come? You're not going to pay a lawyer to review 6 contracts, but you got to knock it down yourself. So I want to go through some of the things that are relevant for you as you're looking at it. Okay. So the first thing is the scope of services, right? Is your job primarily clinical? Every job has some administrative thing to do it, right? You have to do coding, you have to do billing, you have to enter in your note, do things like that. I'm just going to throw out something else not relating to this. Just a good tip for as you're going through this. You have to find some way to distinguish your notes, right? If you saw 10 patients today, and if I took the name out, I could read the same note 10 times and they all say exactly the same. You're going to get yourself into trouble down the road. Or if you have the same person came to you 10 months in a row, and each one of the visits again has exactly the same note, you need to find some way to distinguish it. I know nowadays people have templates and it's very hard to distinguish. I'm telling you just as a tip for yourself, really, you got to find a way to distinguish it, because otherwise, I don't know if you ever got a speeding ticket and the cop gets up there and says, yeah, the person was going, looks at his note 72 in the 55 zone and can't tell you anything about you. It's great well, it's great for the cops when they're in the, that court because the judges just listen to them. When you're in court trying to defend and saying that, yeah, I remember treating this patient, when your note is exactly the same for everybody, the note is almost meaningless. So just keep in mind, you have to have some specificity in it. I will also, again, just throw out another tip for you, nothing to do with the contracts, but I deal a lot with claims coming down the road. And one of the things that we see all the time is that people tell me, oh, I remember this case. It was a crazy case. We had all these problems with it. And I told the person they must go to the emergency room right now. And you go back and you read the note and there's nothing about it in there, right? And at that point, the only question is how much money are you paying, not whether or not you are paying. Okay. Hours, right? Is it full-time versus part-time? What about outside services? Can you do things on the weekend? Can you have another job? Can you be involved in things, right? These are all things that you might not think about on day one, but then all of a sudden you have a job and your friend comes to you and says, I'm setting up something else. I need someone to be involved in it. Can you help me out? Can you be part of it? Where you can make an extra $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 for doing relatively a small amount on the weekends. And then your contract might restrict you from doing it. Usually the contract will restrict you from doing it unless you negotiate something about it. So again, there's something to keep in mind as you're looking at it. Okay, on call, What's
the benefit to the employee from not letting you work outside hours at some other place?
So the benefit to the employer is that they want to make sure that you're not going to come to work, right? So we had years ago, there was a guy who was a musician in a band. And at night, he'd go out and play and be out until 3 o'clock in the morning playing, come to work the next day and be, completely exhausted and couldn't treat patients well. So because of that, lawyers tend to build in just a blanket. You cannot do anything outside of this without getting our permission. That's what a typical contract says. But there is logic to it. They also are worried about malpractice because now if you're going out and treating patients someplace else and someone Googles you, right, they can Google your name and they can see you're associated with this practice, they're going to end up suing this practice because of something you did, and even though you didn't work for the practice. So they want to end up having to pay, but they'll end up having to pay for a lawyer to defend them in that case. I also mentioned if you're doing outside activities, almost never does the insurance that you have from your employer cover what you're doing outside. So you need to have a separate policy for that. You could buy a part-time policy depending on the specialty. Right? In OB, you're not going to be able to buy a part-time policy. You're going to need to have a second job, pay for the first policy, let alone the second policy. But depending on the specialty, it could be relatively inexpensive. Almost all jobs on call, you're going to have on-call responsibilities when you're starting out. What you're really looking for here is how long do you have the on-call and how much call are you going to have to deal with? Are you going to have to deal with? And then something to keep in mind is very often on-call for hospitals requires you, when you're on call to be within 20 miles or 30 miles of them. And so if you're taking a job where you're working, you're driving an hour each day to get to work. I mean, in Brooklyn, that could be 3 miles, but theoretically, you're driving an hour each way. You could have a problem. You go home at night. The nights you're on call, even though you're not going to get any calls, you might need to stay in the hospital for those nights. So really something to think about that relates to that. Okay, location. Where are they sending you? Right. So I mentioned there's a lot of practices now that have many offices. And you think you're going to the office in Teaneck, and all of a sudden now they say, no, now you're going to Atlantic City tomorrow, right? Now you have to think about driving and adding that to your day. So it's something you have to look at as well. These are all not legal things. These are all practical things that you need to just keep in mind. Okay. Also something very important at the end of every contract, almost every contract, there is like a page and a half worth of representations that you have to make to the employer. You were never sued, you never got arrested, all these kinds of things. Read them because sometimes it's not really true when you're making this representation. And now you did it and you made a false representation. Now, if they want to fire you, they can fire you on 1 minute's notice because you lied to them when you signed the contract. And the lawyers don't really pay attention to it. They tell the client, you look this and make sure it's okay. Actually read it and make sure it really is okay. Okay, next. Okay, compensation. So how much are you going to get paid for, right? This is the thing that's probably most relevant to all of you. How much am I getting paid? So something to think about here is most contracts have a base salary, but is there some availability of incentives, right? And being able to understand how incentives work and what's realistic for you to be able to do. So again, I feel like I'm not talking to anyone in particular. When people are young and come out of school, it's very idealistic, and I'm going to spend 45 minutes with every patient, and give them all the time they need. And then actual financial pressure start to come. And again, if you're working in a hospital, maybe that's great. If you're working in a private practice, that's never going to happen, right? In a private practice, the expectation, again, depending on the specialty, is any place from 3.5 to 8 visits an hour. If you're in pediatrics, expectation is probably 12 visits an hour. And so you have, if you're going to be doing 12 visits an hour, you should be getting paid for doing 12 visits an hour and not just getting a base compensation for it, right? So you should be thinking about some of those things when you're negotiating your contract. It's very hard after the fact to go back and say, I was working so hard, give me more money. No, we're not going to do it. You sign the contract and that's it. So that's something to think about up front. There are also a variety of, like, so I'll just mention another thing, moving. If you have to move someplace, usually you should be entitled to get some bonus to deal with your moving costs to move there. Not if you're moving 3 blocks, but you're moving to a different state, that's usually something you should be able to negotiate. Then also, what am I getting next year? What increases am I getting year to year, right? That's important because it's not automatic. And if you sign a contract that says you're getting paid $150,000, that's what your contract is going to be, unless you go back and try to renegotiate, which usually contracts are for 3 years. You're not going to be able to renegotiate within those 3 years. Okay, next.
Do you mind delving in a little bit into like the RVUs and?
Oh, yes. Okay. So there are some contracts. Okay, so I don't know if you guys learned about RVUs. RVUs is relative value units, right? So the most basic example I could say is if you have someone who spends 15 minutes doing a regular encounter with a patient who came in because their throat hurts and they might have strep throat, that has like 1 RVU associated. Relative value units mean what's the value to the system of what you're doing. I'm not telling you this is worth less or more. I'm just telling you that's how they measure it. That's like 1 RVU. If you do a surgery in those 15 minutes, that's going to be 1,000 RVU. And so very often you have contracts that are RVU based. You need to understand your specialty and need to look into what those RVUs really mean. Because again, you might be thinking I'm doing just a lot of regular encounters. And if that's the case and you're getting paid an RVU method, you're never going to hit any kind of measure that's going to get you that bonus. So you need to look at how you're getting paid and how that relates to your specialty. Okay, so term. So something that's interesting that happens, right? So usually you'll sign the contract, I don't know, 6 months in advance of you starting, 4 months in advance of you starting, because hopefully you're not actually having finished everything and then first looking for a contract. You usually get it earlier on. So you want to look at the contract to see, are you bound and are they bound? Because you signed the contract and all of a sudden a month later, you find you get a better job, and they say, I don't want to take that job, but you already signed the contract. So did you bind yourself already from then or not, right? That's the big issue that comes up. And the same way, the reverse. Now, all of a sudden, they get a better candidate than you. Are they going to turn around and say, oh, you're supposed to start in 3 months? Forget it. You're not starting because we found someone else instead of you. So you got to look at when the contract starts. And then the other issue is termination. I'm sorry. So you have a 3-year contract, right? Almost never do you actually have a 3-year contract. Usually built into the contract is something called termination without cause. What that means is that at any time, either party can say to the other party, even though it's a 3-year contract, on 30 days notice, get out, right? You could say, I quit. They could say, get out on 30 days notice. It is standard for that to happen, that you have that. You can negotiate instead of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, something like that. But you want to make sure that at the very least, it's equitable both ways. Not that you can't get out for 3 years, but they could fire you on 30 days notice, which often is in contracts. That's something you should be able to negotiate, and you should be able to get at least that both sides have the same time frame. Okay. Other things are, again, keeping in mind that I'm talking about your first contract versus later contracts, is when you get beyond your first couple of years, you should be able to negotiate to not have that. And then you have to think about notice periods, right? So if they want to not renew your contract, how long do you need to now be able to find another job, right? You always have to balance that. I want to be able to quit tomorrow. You can't quit tomorrow, but usually it's the same amount of time. So I would say that the average person needs 60 to 90 days to find another job. So you don't want to have a contract that only has 30 days termination without cause, but then they fire you on 30 days notice. It's not going to give you enough time to find another job. I didn't put up here, depending on how senior you get, this I'm really trying to address when you're first starting, but you can negotiate severance as well. If you get terminated, they'll have to pay you out for 6 months or something like that. That's usually not going to happen in an initial contract, in your first contract. Okay, next slide. Okay, other things that are very important, right? Paid time off, right? So again, you just finished school, you're thrilled, you're getting your job. You need to think about, right, especially as a firm person, you have to take up all these days for Yom Tov, right? If you have a year when you have every day of Yom Tov, you could have 12 to 14 days of Yom Tov, include our Erev Yom Tov. I'm not even talking about Chol Hamoed. Your contract might give you 3 weeks of time off. That means you have 1 day vacation for the year, 3 days vacation for the year. So you got to think about trying to negotiate to get more than that, because most of the places are not going to be closed for Yom Tov unless you're working in a firm place, but otherwise not going to be closed. That's something to really think about. Also, to the extent you have more, most employers do not allow carryover, right? So you had 20 days this year and you only use 10 because you want to hit your bonus, or because you feel like the first year you don't want to take all your days. Now you want to carry over. Usually you do not have that right unless you specifically negotiate. Okay, retirement and insurance. Insurance, usually almost always the employer pays for your malpractice insurance. The big issue is what's called, I think we have a separate slide about tail insurance. Let me see if I have a separate thing on it, or I'll talk about it here. Oh, I'll have a separate slide. I'll talk about it there. Okay. Retirement, disability, this is no different than any other employer, right? You can have money that's put away for you, pension plans. Usually there's a vesting period. That means that until you've been here for 2 years, all the money we put away towards your retirement doesn't really go to you. Now, if you're putting your own money away, that's not going to be the case. But if they're matching or they're giving you money, usually there's going to be a vesting period before it actually becomes yours. And so you want to negotiate. If they fire you, that they should have to give you the money that was put away for you. Right? If you quit, they're not going to do it. But if they fire you, you want to be able to have that. Okay, so next slide. I think we covered most of these, right? We talked about loan forgiveness already. We talked about severance. Okay, licensing fees, things like that. CME, usually the employer pays for that. You should not have to pay for any of those things yourself.
That's something we should look for in the actual contract.
Yes. It's either, so usually that'll be in their benefit plans, but you should ask to see their benefit plan when you're negotiating the contract. Okay, next slide.
Can the contract modify the benefits plan, like you get the special accommodation or something?
Yes, absolutely. Because the benefit plan is the same for everybody, but that applies to you and applies to the secretary. So if you want to have something special that could be put into your contract, and the contract says that it supersedes any other document, some of the legalese at the end of a contract. Okay, restrictive covenants. This is a very big thing. I don't know if you're following along the newspapers, but it's a big topic nationally and locally. Right now, restrictive covenants still are enforceable. There was a big push in New York this year to try to do away with restrictive covenants. The governor ended up not signing. I personally think that if they do away with restrictive covenants, it's going to make it much harder for people to find jobs. Because, if I'm a doctor now and I'm busy and I'm thinking about adding another person, restrictive covenant basically says that you can't steal away my patients and you can't go work within 3 miles of my office, So if I'm a doctor and I'm busy and my wife is complaining to me, never home, so I'm going to hire somebody else. I now know that if I hire that person, they can leave after 6 months and go, or after 2 years and go across the street and take all my patients. I'm much less likely to hire somebody. I think you have to assume almost every contract has a restrictive covenant in it. Until they do away with it, you should assume that it will be there. Some of the things to think about when you're negotiating that are, what if they fire you without cause? Are you subject to it or not? I want to say in your first job, you have most of the time the answer is you are going to be subject to it, but this is an important thing to negotiate for, Because otherwise you might have to move away to a completely different area depending on where it is. The mileage, I want to say that within New York State or New Jersey, generally you're talking about it could be up to 10 miles. Beyond 10 miles is usually not enforceable. If you're talking about New York City, they'll say the 5 boroughs, 4 boroughs, not Manhattan. You're talking about 3 miles. In Manhattan, you're talking about 5 to 10 blocks is what's enforceable for a restrictive covenant. Again, this could change. The federal government is talking about changing it. I don't know if it will or not, but as of right now, this is the biggest impediment in contracts is you could go start work there and then end up having to move someplace completely different. Next, malpractice insurance. Okay, so there's 2 different types of malpractice insurance. One is claims made and the other is occurrence. The basic difference is for claims made is much cheaper than occurrence. The concept of claims made is you have to be covered under the policy when the incident when the claim occurred, the actual treatment of the patient or lack of treatment of the patient occurred, and still be covered under the same policy when the person brings the claim, So in 2023, The patient says that you misdiagnosed them and something happens to them. And now in 2026, they bring the claim. There's a 3-year statute of limitation. It means they have 3 years to bring a claim for this. So if you're not covered under the same policy in 2026, then even though you were covered in 2023, you will not have insurance for it. So if you have claims made, what you have to do practically, occurrence means that it doesn't make a difference. As long as you had the insurance when the incident happened, you're covered. If you have claims made, then you have to buy what's called a tail. Tail insurance means that you're converting the claims made policy into an occurrence policy, meaning you still have the insurance in place. I know this is very complicated. Remember this piece, okay? For everything today, claims made versus occurrence. To buy a tail policy, so if your regular policy is $25,000 a year, to buy a tail is going to cost $75,000. It's generally 3 times the cost of the policy about.
Why would anyone ever get a claims policy then?
Because when I'm buying the policy this year for the year, and I said it was 25,000 for the claims made, if I wanted to buy occurrence, it's 50,000. So I
in
don't
the
want
long run, but if you have to buy the tail as well.
right, but your employer usually will give you claims made, they won't give you occurrence.
Oh, so it's 0 versus 50,000.
Correct. But the thing to know is about negotiating the tail. What happens if you get fired? Are you going to be able, or who's going to pay the tail? Right, that's a very large expense, right? Depending on what specialty you're in, right? I said 25,000, that's like internal medicine. If you're in one of the more expensive specialties, the tail could end up being 250,000. Right, so this is a very high dollar issue. And again, most of the time when you're starting out your first contract, they're only going to provide you claims made, and it's going to be your responsibility to buy the tail. Now, I just want to tell you there is one potential saving grace here, which is that, let's say in New York, there are only a handful of malpractice carriers. If you switch employers and the new employer has the same policy, the same company, then you don't have to worry about this because the policy will travel over with you. Yes.
Is the tail like a one-time thing that you pay, or you continue paying $75,000 every year?
It's a one-time thing, but now you still have to buy new insurance for your new job. It's not covering, it's only covering the old job now, not the new job.
Do you have data? I know this is kind of I'm sure it's going to change by specialty. Any data on kind of the relative risk of getting sued at different points to make an evidence-based decision as to how long your tail needs to be?
So the answer to that, I don't have the data. I'm sure there is data out there, but
Like OBGYN might be
in the
18
nicest
years
way
plus.
possible. No, it's when you buy a tail, it converts it. That means you're changing it to an occurrence policy. You're paying one time. You could buy just a 1-year extended period instead of a 3-year. It's only 1 to 3 because the longest someone could sue you after an incident happened is 3 years. And with only exception would be pediatrics, or if the pediatrics could be longer. But usually in pediatrics, you don't have significant claims. No, that's only if it was a minor when the incident happened. If it was an adult, then it's only 3 years. At least in New York and New Jersey. I don't want to say other states.
What's the baby?
No, because, well, unless you did something to the baby that,
Yeah, if you made a mistake, in the delivery, then
I
it's
don't think
18
so.
years plus 3.
I think that's the pediatrics. I'm not sure that it is OB. I don't want to say for sure.
The tail is retroactively converting the coverage to current,
Yes.
or it's continuing coverage through the statute of limitations.
I mean, effectively, that's the same thing. It depends on how they write it, but it ends up being the same thing because once you have it through then the statute of limitations, that's the same thing as having occurrence. Okay, next. Okay, other things, there's a whole list here. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. I'll just talk about a couple of them. Okay, important ones. Indemnification. Okay, indemnification means that, let's say I'm hiring you and I hire you and you mess up on a claim. And now they sue me also. So can I come to you and say that besides you being responsible for it, you're gonna have to pay my legal fees as well, right? I want to say that some contracts have this in it. You should not be signing a contract that has indemnification in it. That is a very unfair provision. And it's very rare that we see it. The only time we see it is when people didn't go to a lawyer, knew about it, and let them sign it. You should not be having indemnification, being required to indemnify anybody. Okay, medical records, something for you to know. It's a little bit complicated because theoretically the patient belongs to you, but the charts you almost always belong to the practice, not to you. So if you want to leave, you cannot take charts. The patient could sign an authorization telling the practice to give you the charts, but you cannot just go ahead and take charts, right? Don't go in and do a download of all the charts the day before you leave. You're going to get sued. Okay, next. Okay, so I think I've talked about a bunch of the things on this slide now, but one of the things I'll just mention is I talked about a lot of things today. You're not going to get everything. You're not going to get more than 2 or 3 of the things I talked about today. You have to sit for yourself and prioritize what's most important to you. Because when I used to review these contracts, I would say to the person, you know, okay, tell me, here's a list of 10 things. Tell me which of these is most important. And I don't wait till the lawyer comes back to you and says which is the most important. Now you have to make a decision in 10 minutes. When you get the contracts, you think about some of these things and analyze them and come up by yourself as to what's most important to you. Okay, next. Sorry. Okay, so I was asked to address a little bit about, you know, providing services during residency. Okay, so until you have a license, you cannot do anything. Once you have a license, you are licensed and you could theoretically go out and provide services even during residency. However, there are a few things that go with it. Number one is you need to have separate malpractice insurance, right? So if you're going to have a job where you're doing residency, you're going to make $25,000, most likely the policy is going to cost you that, so you're not really going to make anything. Even a part-time policy, maybe cost you a little bit less. You have to think about the Indian malpractice. Whatever malpractice you have through the hospital is not going to cover any outside activity. You also have to think about, and this there's no way I can address, but you'll have to look yourself. Many residency programs have restrictions on this and have limitations. You can only do this for 5 hours a week or something like that. You have to look at that, right? You don't want to get to that point and get kicked out of your residency program because you had an outside job. Okay, other things that you need to think about is you want to write prescriptions. So if you have a license, you can write prescriptions. But if you want to write controlled substances, you need to have a DEA number. When you're in the hospital, you're doing it under the hospital's DEA number or the supervising physician. Now you need to get one yourself. It's not complicated to do, but you can't forget that you need to do that in order to be able to write the prescription. Again, so someone had a specific question about being able to supervise other people. You are a licensed physician, so you can supervise a PA or an NP. You can have those people working for you as you're doing. Okay, next.
But you need to get a general malpractice insurance in order to supervise them.
Right, well, they need to have, either you have to have insurance that covers them or they have to have their own insurance, which you get named as an additional insured. Okay, question?
I was on that.
Okay.
So just can you just explain what moonlighting is? It's like working extra hours when you're in residency at your actual hospital?
No, it's working someplace else, right? You're working in the hospital and you're working 60 hours a week, right? But you're still not making any money. You're making very little money. And now on Sundays, you have free time. You're off on Sunday. And someone said, can you come work in an urgent care on Sunday for me?
So it's not worth it because you could have to get separate.
I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm saying that you have to analyze how much you're getting paid versus how much you're getting a part-time policy. It might be the place you're working for is willing to get you the policy because they want you to be able to work there, right? I'll using urgent care as a real example. People are desperate for people to work in urgent care, so that they would very likely be willing to pay the malpractice for you. I'm just saying you need to now think about, does your residency program allow you to do that?
Can you elaborate on the baby with the new infection?
Wait, the what?
The case of the baby with
Keeping record.
keeping record.
Okay, so when you're in the hospital, right, there's an EMR and you have a ability to keep a record, right? Now you're going off by yourself doing moonlighting, and now, so let me use a different example, okay? You're home Friday night and someone knocks on your door and says, my kid's ear is hurting, can you take a look at it? Right, so first of all, I want to tell you that when you're in residency, if you don't have a separate policy, it's up to you to decide what to do, but you're not covered for that. If you go and look at that kid's ear, you do not have any malpractice insurance for that. So I know you want to balance between being a decent person and worrying about malpractice. I'm just telling you from a legal perspective, you don't have malpractice insurance, and so if you screw that up and they sue you, you're going to pay out of pocket. I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just letting you know about that. But then the second piece is keeping records of it. Right? In your hospital, you put it into EMR. Where are you keeping records now that you treated this person? Right? I'll just throw out together with that. You need to have the patient sign a consent. You have to have a privacy notice. You need HIPAA policy. You need a lot of documents to be able to do moonlighting if you're doing this by yourself. If you're working for somebody else, then presumably they have all that in place. But if you're working for yourself, which is actually the next slide, you're now need to set all of this up to be able to do it. I want to suggest that doing moonlighting by yourself in your house while you're in school it's a big project to be able to do while you're in residency. I'm not telling you not to, I'm just saying it's a big project.
I would just add from the medical perspective, in terms of moonlighting, there are often opportunities to moonlight within your own hospital and sometimes in a different department with your coverage from, you're in the same hospital that would cover, even if you're in a different department.
Okay, so if that's.
I'm asking if it would cover you in a different department.
Yes, if your hospital insurance covers you for anything in the hospital, so it would cover it. Might be subject to the same rules I mentioned before about, how many hours you could work, what else you can do. But yeah, that would take care of all the problems that I just talked about.
And is there any Good Samaritan coverage?
Almost none. Like Good Samaritan coverage is literally.
No, like the Good Samaritan policy.
I understand what you're
Yeah.
saying. Yeah, so if there's an accident, you run into it, yes, but that Good Samaritan does not apply when someone's knocking on your door Friday night.
Does the Good Samaritan policy, whatever law, change at all if you're a licensed physician? Like, can you, like, don't do more than CPR or whatever, but don't start intubating, but are you more liable?
So you are more likely to be sued. I wouldn't say you're more liable, you're more likely to be sued. Right, I'm not telling you not to do it again, and it's very hard to address that because that's a state-by-state rule, it's not a federal rule. And so each state has different rules for Good Samaritan. In many states, it's a blanket exception, in other states, it's not a blanket exception. So if if you want to talk about a specific state, I could try to do that, but again, I'm not discouraging you from doing it, but.
Let's just say New York.
Right. So in New York, you are protected. Doesn't stop someone from suing you, which again, you don't have any coverage. So if you do that, again, this is sounding terrible. I'm being the lawyer. As a person, I'm telling you, you should do it. As a lawyer, if you end up getting sued, you're paying out of pocket for a lawyer to defend you. It's going to cost you a minimum of $50,000 as a practical matter. So I leave it up to you. I will say that I've had this conversation with physicians who have been working for 25 years and work at an FQHC, and then again, all of a sudden on Friday night or Shabbos, someone's knocking at the door and they don't have malpractice coverage either. And they ask me the same question. I have to give them the same answer, right? I tell them it might be worth you buying a part-time policy because if you have a full-time job and you're only doing a little bit on the weekends, you could probably buy a part-time policy for $2,500, $5,000. And it might be worth it for you to do that so that you could feel like you're a good neighbor, a good person, people to be able to come to, but otherwise you don't have malpractice. And like I say, even if you're 100% right, you still have to pay an attorney to defend it. And I want to say it's $50,000. I'm being conservative in terms of the number.
Can't countersuit for lawyer fees or something?
No. In most states, you're not entitled to attorney's fees, regardless. Right? You're only entitled to attorney's fees if you bring what's called civil rights type claim, but you're not bringing a civil rights claim. Okay, so I think we talked about this already. Okay, any questions? Any other questions?
Mandated reporter?
Okay, so let's
So yeah,
I mean, we asked this question in the session last night.
okay. So
Wait.